Hello and welcome to session 2 or lecture video 2 of module 7, talking about loss, grief, and bereavement in palliative hospice and end-of-life care. There are many things influencing grief, the grief process, the grief journey, grief work. Some of these things are things like survivor personality, coping skills, history of abuse, relationship to the deceased. It can be things like age of the survivor and the deceased, nature of relationship, is it conflicting, adoring, congeal? Is there a financial gain, such as is there VA benefits or a big life insurance payout? This can complicate grief and make it much harder for the survivor to cope with. Different spiritual beliefs influence and play into grief and the grief process. The type of death, whether it was sudden versus long-term chronic or suicide. Cultural traditions, rites, and rituals of the survivor. These are really, they vary, and throughout the world there are many rituals and mourning practices in different cultures, which provides a context for the grief experience. So it gives its members a sense of security and cohesion, as well as emotional, social, and physical resources in which to frame the grief. And I will say, from my own personal experience, when my grandma died, I cared for her at the end of her life, and she was able to die at home, and I provided the postmortem care, and I notified family. And the next day when family started coming over, I was asking about funeral arrangements. When are we going to do that? Where is it going to be? And all of her kids were saying, oh, we're not going to have a funeral. And it was so weird to me, and it was interesting. It was a learning experience for me, because I'd always hated going to funerals. I mean, no one wants to go to a funeral or enjoys funerals, but I never recognized or appreciated the healing part of the ceremony and the ritual of a funeral. And I felt like my ability and my right to grieve and to have some sort of social recognition of my grief at that funeral, it was taken away from me. And so it was interesting. Like I said, it was a learning experience, and I never realized how meaningful that cultural practice was. So consider others who have important cultural rituals or rites or ceremonies that they do not get to enact. Like, that's important to them too, and that also impacts their grief. There are so many things impacting grief. I cannot even begin to address all of them, but a few others include suicidal tendencies, perhaps a history of mental illness or depression. Survivor gender really impacts the grief and grief recovery, what support systems are available, prior experience or history of loss, preparation for the death or to have had the death occur. These all influence grief. Some of the things patients have said that they fear, and it's kind of an anticipatory grief for them, are fading away. So that people don't want to be a burden. They struggle with this paradox of I'm living with cancer, but I'm also dying with cancer. There's a lot of changes to contend to. Patients and families change roles, socialization, work patterns. They know that the life that they are so used to and have lived will soon be gone. And again, there's that searching for meaning that occurs. Patients tend to have a journey inward. They seek spiritual reflection and become more connected with friends and family that are really important to them. And family members will also search for meaning, or they may just tolerate the situation. It's going to be different for absolutely everybody. One of the neat ways to help those who are dying to deal with this grief and this loss are things called legacy work. So some things that hospitals or palliative organizations will do are things like writing letters. They could write a letter, not necessarily to anybody, maybe to their kids, maybe to somebody, but telling the story of their life. Or journaling, or if they can't do that, just recording them talking about their life. It's a way for them to share their stories. It's a way for their stories to be captured, and so that they know that their story will live on even when they're gone. Remembering the caregiver is incredibly important. Like I mentioned in the introduction video, they are such a huge workforce and they care for the patient 24/7. They don't get to go home at the end of their shift. The end of their shift doesn't happen. So most patients will have a family of caregivers, a team. Most of these caregivers are women. $37 billion hours of unpaid care per year is provided by family caregivers. And that equates to about $470 billion. So there's a lot that goes into caregiving, and it's important to remember the family and the toll that it takes upon them and to acknowledge that. Caregivers in their grief really want to know that their loved one's wishes are being honored. The caregiver typically wants to be included in decision making, which makes sense. They're often looking for support and assistance with practical things. So things that like going to the grocery store or to the pharmacy, or how can they get their laundry done, different things like that. Caregivers really want honest conversation, to be listened to, and presence. I cannot tell you how important being present is. It is a very powerful thing that you can do for somebody in their grief, and you don't even have to say anything. You can just sit there quietly. Caregivers also, they want their to be remembered, the care that they provide to be remembered as being good, and to have been a compassionate caregiver, and really to just be assured that they did everything they could possibly do for their loved one. So as you are caring for the family unit and the family caregivers in their grief, provide that reassurance. Listen to them. Say, I could clearly see how much you care for your whoever it is. I could see all that you're doing for them. Just acknowledge what it is that they're doing. Some facilities will have grief and bereavement programs, and in order to have a recognized bereavement program according to the 2018 National Consensus Project for Quality Palliative Care, everything outlined on this slide is necessary for a bereavement program. So I'll let you pause the video and read those. Grief is a process, and it is normal. It is a normal process. It begins before the death occurs in the patient, and it continues through anticipatory loss and throughout the loss experience. So grief, again, it's a process, and it's not always orderly or predictable. So people talk about going through a loss, growing through the loss, but they're still experiencing great distress, even if the death occurred. It could be weeks ago, months ago, years ago, even decades ago. They can continue to experience that grief and distress. The emotions associated with the grieving process, it's normal for them to be waves and to kind of oscillate and come, and a lot of times people will say they feel like they don't have control over what it is that they're feeling or the emotions that come, and that's all a normal part of the grief process. Often people say that the pain of loss is unbearable. Grief cannot be prevented, but healthy grieving can be facilitated. So distinguishing between grief and depression, or grief and complicated grief, can be very, very challenging, because the experiences, the emotions, they are often very similar, especially to depression. So remember, depression, it's not a normal aspect of dying, so it should be carefully assessed and treated. Now, feelings of sadness are often associated with grief and very normal with grief, but depression is associated with a loss of self-worth. So grief, loss, depression, loss of self-worth. So how do you begin the dialogue to distinguish the difference? Just a question. Are you sad or are you feeling depressed? Are you feeling sad or are you feeling depressed? Just open that door to talk about it with the patient and with the family. Culture is very important. Often it dictates how someone thinks that they should act during the bereavement period, how they express their grief, how they act in their grief. And it's important to remember to have a spiritual assessment that the reconciliation with self-worth, guilt, forgiveness. There might be some complicated relationships and resolution does not occur before the death. So trying to set things right, either with a loved one, with a family member, with God or a higher being, those can all be parts of the grieving process. There are different types of grief. I've mentioned anticipatory grief several times. And anticipatory grief is grieving a loss that has not yet occurred. So in the case of a terminal diagnosis, grieving the loss of independence that will be lost, or grieving the loss of life, anticipating the loss that is to come, so the grief begins before the loss actually occurs. This can happen to the patient and also to the family members. Acute grief is that really sudden onset. And then normal grief, I talk about normal grief. So again, there's no such thing as normal, but grief that falls within our expected limit. So grief should not be debilitating. It should not be wrought with depression. It should not be chronic, like someone should not be incapacitated by grief for months and months and years. So when I talk about normal grief, I'm talking about the visceral response to loss, that emotional reaction that occurs with loss. Complicated grief is grief above and beyond the normal grief. So this is that debilitating grief, often characterized by depression, anxiety, PTSD. There can be physical side effects as well, things like obesity, hypertension, diabetes, even cancers have been associated with complicated grief. Now, disenfranchised grief is a grief that is not validated or recognized by others. So society may not want to acknowledge grief because they don't know how to deal with it. An example would be pregnancy loss. As a society, we hold these expectations that parents will bury their children and that modern medicine prevents the death of babies and prevents death during pregnancy, but that's not reality. So because we want to hold to this belief as societies that babies don't die, we cannot acknowledge the death of a baby or death occurring during pregnancy loss, because that contradicts the beliefs that we hold dearly to ourselves, because we just don't want to believe that that can happen. And so not recognizing loss that someone is experiencing, that's disenfranchising their experience. That's not granting permission to those who experience the loss to grieve. Those who are at high risk for disenfranchised grief, partners of HIV or AIDS, ex-spouses, ex-partners, fiancés, friends, lovers, mistresses, co-workers, children experiencing the death of a step-parent, women, husbands, partners who have experienced a terminated pregnancy or a stillbirth or a miscarriage. These are all groups of people who deeply, deeply grieve in their loss but are not recognized in society. So if you have a patient that they do have a non-traditional family, that their partner did die from AIDS, it is an ex-spouse, it's very important to recognize and acknowledge the grief that that family member, that person, that individual is experiencing. As an example, I'll use my grandma again. Taking care of her, she had divorced her husband for I think it was at least 40 years prior to her death. And they originally lived in California. They divorced. She moved up here. She brought the kids, and he moved up here as well so he could be close to the kids. And her ex-husband, my grandpa, was the first person I called to say that she had died. And he's been remarried for at least 35 years, I believe. And so he was in a interesting position because this was his ex-wife that died. He has a current wife, and he was very involved in helping me out with her care and everything. And it was there's good relationships, but it's interesting for him to grieve because it's not his wife, it's his ex-wife. And how can he express his grief to his current wife in losing his former wife? So it's just, you can see how it gets really messy in there, but it's really important to address this type of grief. Of course, we always assess. There are different questionnaires that you can use in a grief assessment. The biggest thing, having that relationship, listening, being present, and looking for complicated grief. Again, things that you can do specifically for the survivors is to listen to their stories, listen to them talk about their loved one. Engage in that active listening and touch if it's appropriate, silence, reassurance, identify and connect them with support systems, refer them to bereavement support and resources. Normalize and individualize the grief process. I can't tell you how important it is to normalize the response. So someone might be just angry. They are pissed off that their loved one is dead. And anger is a normal response to grief. So acknowledge that. Say, yeah, it's not fair. A lot of people feel very angry if they're in a situation similar to yours. Allow them to talk about it. Let them know that they are not abnormal in their grief. Here's if you feel like watching a video kind of illustrates some of these things. Everyone has a story. Children's grief. So this is especially if you have a younger parent. It's really different addressing children's grief, yet very important. So a lot of symptoms are unique to children. They can be either normal or complicated, and they are all based on stages of development. So it's important to consider the developmental stage of the child. And remember, developmental stage is not the same as age. So notice the developmental stage. Referring children to support groups may be very helpful. When you're talking to children, I do want to put this in there. Be very, very careful about the words that you use. So if you are explaining to a young child, your grandpa just went to sleep and then never woke up. This would be very, very comforting to somebody who is an adult who understands what that means. To a child, that might be terrifying. They might be afraid that if they go to sleep, they're never going to wake up like their grandpa. And so they develop all of these phobias and fears. So just be really mindful of the words you use as you talk to children. There are many different modalities of grief support. It can be online, it can be individual counseling, different rituals, community support, group support, social support. So there are a lot of different ways to provide survivors, living caregivers, with tools to cope with their grief. So just really work closely with social work. They are magnificent, and counselors are great at knowing what resources are available in the community. So grief is work, and the work of grief is never completely finished. So healing occurs when the pain is less. So the pain is not going to go away. And acknowledging that, letting people know, this pain, it's never going to go away. It's just every day you learn how to live with it. That's the reality of grief. And here's a little example. of some of the complicated things that can occur. So if you want to take a minute and read through it, think on it, ponder it, then that is up